Hello and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I say the Tifo Football Podcast. It is slightly different today because I am not Joe Devine. I am in fact John McKenzie, and I'm in this seat very much against my will, which is usually the case on the Tifo Football Podcast anyway. But we are here and we are joined by people. There's been a few injuries in the Tifo Football Podcast squad, but we have rallied forth, and so I've got the equivalent of Radu Dragusin and Archie Gray here today. Make of that which one you want to be. But I think
I was just thinking of the Archie Gray in these substitutions.
Yeah, it's a very clear ordering in my head. So yeah, Radu Dragusin, welcome on the show.
Hello.
It is in fact Nick Miller, heady in the enjoyment of his football club right now.
Very much so.
Another great result for you guys at the weekend, and I think swiftly becoming that dangerous prospect of everyone's second favourite team or something, right, this season.
Yeah, Forest, there's Nottingham Forest, by the way, for
not Forest. I think we should.
Don't try and harsh my buzz here. we Forest were very sort of familiar with that in a kind of very patronising way when we were, in the. It was probably about sort of 15 years ago when everyone remembered when Forest were quite good and remembered it being quite nice, but were actually no threat to their team. So everyone was like, oh yeah, it'd be good to see Nottingham Forest back in the Premier League now, wouldn't it? So it's a sort of slight harking back to that.
And here we are.
And here we are.
Wonderful stuff. Archie Gray, also known as Alex Barker.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very good. I'm looking forward to the point where we all collectively, in an English way, say, actually, we hate Forest and we want them to stop falling down now.
I would prefer that, I think.
And in front of us, we have a stacked docket. Oh boy, the docket is very fun. I'm just trying to think of what Joe would say. Something like that, I'm sure. But the docket, hella full for you, hella full for me, hella full for everybody. So today what we're going to speak about is, well, firstly, Tottenham Hotspur and their Postecoglou problem. That Postecoglou problem comes in the form of what do you do when you have a manager who maybe you want to get rid of, but now is not the right time. I don't know, maybe you do want to keep him. I'm sure Spurs fans have opinions both ways. Is this the worst Manchester United team in history? Or is this just a terrible headline? That headline itself actually came from Ruben Amorim, who is himself sort of posing interesting problems to his team in terms of the future as well as a manager. We also talked about PSG, I believe they call them in France. That's short for Paris Saint Germain. They aren't the club that we thought they were anymore or something. They're PPDA through the roof. Although it's the other way round, so I don't know what the metaphor is.
Through the floor.
It's through the floor.
It's on the other side of the earth.
That's bad, though, isn't it? It sounds bad to me.
It's technically good.
It's through the floor to quite a nice kind of basement conversion.
Okay.
It's actually neither good or bad. It's just through the floor. It's just chilling.
Through the
it's
floor.
Australia.
And we're also going to play the Yeet a ton of money game too. We're going to think a little bit more about the meta level questions that game actually poses, because it may seem on the surface to be a playful little game of no consequence, but actually reveals things about ourselves that none of us knew were to be true. And we also end with points are bad. So that's the docket. It's hella full for everybody. And I guess this is the point where Joe thinks of something to say to get going into the podcast. So I'm just going to say, yeah, let's go. Let's make a podcast.
Woo.
So, in the words of Joe Devine, where else to begin than with Everton 3-2 Tottenham Hotspur? It sounds way too much like Joe. I'm unnerved. But yes, let's start with the Spurs end of that scoreline, because it's bad for Spurs at the moment, seemingly. 15th in the table after 22 games played. But yeah, I think more recently, a little bit more worrying. So the relegation form over the last 6 games is what I was looking at on Transfermarkt. Interestingly enough, so Spurs, I think, are 17th. So that's not relegation, is it? 18th. And then Chelsea are 17th in the form table. Team at the top of the form table, Nick Miller? Famous Forest fan Nick Miller?
I don't know. Can you give me any further clues?
Yeah, I don't think you'll have heard of them. But
no,
yeah, in fact, Forest ahead of everyone, sitting atop of the 6-game form table. But yeah, it's a difficult situation for Spurs because they have a manager who I think is a long-term project manager. The project doesn't seem to be working in the short term, and I guess it's arguable that he is relatively long-term as a manager these days in terms of how long he's been there so far. So what's the situation for you, Nick? I've got the words written down here. Does he have to go? This is from Joe Devine, I should say. And why isn't there more clamouring? Should there be more clamouring, Nick?
I mean, it feels like there is quite a bit of clamour. Well, it's sometimes quite difficult to tell the difference between clamouring and just general despair, particularly with Tottenham fans. I don't know whether here's some insightful analysis for you. I don't know whether the key argument to just keeping him is they've done this before. They've kind of binned off a manager with 2 or 3 months left of the season, and Ryan Mason's still there, so at least he's around to kind of come in and do the thing he's done before again. But yeah, they've done this before. It doesn't really seem to have done them any good. I think that they will just kind of have to weigh up whether they think it will be more. It feels like changing the summer. It feels a little bit inevitable, but they just have to weigh up if it will do even more damage if keeping Postecoglou for the rest of the season. I suppose the answer to the clamouring, why isn't there more clamouring question, is that most of the Spurs fans' ire seems to be directed at Daniel Levy, and which is kind of logical. He's the common theme throughout all of this, which has been a couple of decades of disappointment into Spurs with Mauricio Pochettino.
Do we think that he's to blame in any sort of way, or do you think it's just a sort of big picture? The issue here is with players, and therefore
I think he's probably to blame in some respects, in as much as they've made a series of kind of ill-advised managerial appointments, but also it's just a sort of cycle that fans go on, isn't it? They will. I think you saw it at Leicester as well. There was apparently that got quite ugly at the weekend, but more of the ire seemed to be directed at the board and the sporting director, which is partly because they've just sacked a manager, so you can't really have too much of a go at the current one. But fans just tend to go, we've been angry at the manager for ages, so we just need someone else to be angry about, which isn't entirely the case with Tottenham, and there are big problems there.
It's a good thing about football clubs, isn't there? There's plenty of people that you can blame it on if it suits your agenda.
Yeah.
I want to tease out, Alex, a little bit more this concept of like project managers, because I think that's what Postecoglou has been sold on, this idea of give him time, give him the players, and he can produce something great. The difficulty, I suppose, comes when you reach these kinds of low points in a project. Do you think there's anything about the so-called Ange Postecoglou project right now that means that Spurs should actually should be thinking beyond the summer and just we've got to get to the summer, bring someone else in? Is there anything about this project that really works?
I mean, I think so. I guess I'm more in the camp of backing him, and that's because I think because of the discussion about injuries, right? I'm seeing a lot of parallels, honestly, between him and Erik ten Hag last season, where you had in one camp saying, look how bad they are in the league, look how low down in the table they are, he's got to go. And another camp of Manchester United fans saying, look at the injuries he's had to deal with. What more could you expect? This is such a... what more could you expect from a manager in this position? What would changing the manager do? It's not necessarily his fault. And last season with Ten Hag, I was very much in the other camp of, no, I think where is the plan? Where is the tactical plan? Your question about, is he a good project? Is there enough to believe in? I didn't think there was. But I think it's like a totally different situation with Ange Postecoglou. Yes, there are parallels. Yes, I'm not sure just having injuries is enough of an excuse to be so low down in the table for Tottenham, be so far off European football, closer to the relegation zone than the top four. Especially when people have spoken about how the injuries can be tied back to Ange Postecoglou himself. But it's important to remember they still have one of the best attacks in the league. I think it's the second most goals in the league and the fourth best in terms of expected goals. And there is a clear plan and identity with Tottenham. I just think that it's defensively, it's a horror show at the moment, and you could tie that back to individuals. If I ran the numbers recently, and I just updated them this morning, that with Romero and Van de Ven, they are conceded less than a goal a game, basically. And at the moment, without them, they're at 1.8. It's almost double as bad, their defenders. So, I don't know, I think their attack is good enough reason to think beyond the summer. And I think he has brought enough credit, especially with what Nick was saying about Daniel Levy, right? How you take away Romero and Van der Ven, and suddenly you're onto Ben Davies and Dragusin and Archie Gray playing at centre back. Like that feels like underinvestment in that area. It does feel like that feels like something where I can agree with people saying what manager could make a better use of that. So I don't know. I think I'm willing to give him beyond the summer.
There's a few things to tease out there. I guess on the one hand, in my head, football coaches are employed to get the most out of a squad rather than just the best 11 players, right? And I understand that that's a tricky prospect, right? We see it, for example, Mikel Arteta has had a lot of success with Arsenal over the last few seasons, being able to play his starting 11 fairly regularly. And now in the season where he's starting to get injuries, it's a little bit more difficult to get the same levels out of it. But it's worth talking about the tactical aspects as well. You mentioned the attacking numbers being pretty good. It definitely breaks down into the first half of what we've seen so far and the second half of what we've seen so far. So in the first 10 games of the season, Spurs were conceding the second fewest amounts of expected goals. So their defence was really good and their attack was really good as well. What we've seen happen since the injuries have occurred is that Postecoglou is now, I think, making those tactical tweaks that people have been saying you need to make. And the result has been that they're not improving defensively and their attack has gotten worse as well. So, yeah, I think that's a sort of interesting aspect here as well in that, like, you don't just bring a manager in to get the most out of your best 11 players. You want to have a manager who can actually deal with things when you lose those players as well. And, I think Andoni Iraola, a good example of that. They've got 10 injuries at the moment and they've performed fairly well at the weekend against Newcastle. Jack Pickbrook was pretty scathing on the website over at The Athletic of Spurs this weekend in that game against Everton. And again, this links to what we've been talking about, tactical changes. Postecoglou goes to a back three, and as in Jack's words, was this Postecoglou bravely experimenting or a final roll of the dice? Because this was a defensively disastrous game for Tottenham, as bad as they've played under Postecoglou. Of course, you expect his teams to accept a degree of risk, leaving spaces the opposition can exploit. But this was the worst Spurs have ever been in his tenure, which is pretty damning. So, what thoughts on the tactical tweakery? Is the message from Ange now? Be careful what you wish for.
It felt like there was a degree of logic to him trying what he did. If you bringing Ben Davies back in and you don't necessarily trust, creaking old Ben Davies in a defensive two, then maybe there's a certain amount of logic in trying three at the back, and then because you obviously got two fullbacks who are theoretically could do perfectly well at wing backs. Plus, they didn't really have any wingers, any sort of proper wingers anyway. Therefore, the solution could be play more narrow up front and try and get the wing backs to. Yeah. But I think one of the consequences of that is that you then only have two in midfield, which and there creates the acres of space that Ndiaye, brilliant goal, but he was kind of allowed all that space to run into to score his goal. Maybe there's a sort of consequence of Postecoglou's previous kind of insistence on not switching things around, is that when you sort of almost have to try something else but dictated by circumstances, then you're just playing something that no one is used to. So it's perhaps not a huge surprise that they were terrible. Plus, throw in the fact that people's moods must be pretty low at the moment anyway, and maybe it was a surprise that they got ripped apart by Everton, but
I thought it was quite an interesting tweet, like you say. There was definitely a logic behind it. It's interesting hearing people talk about back threes as though they're inherently defensive, because the impression I got from this was that Postecoglou wanted to keep his in possession shape the same. So we saw Archie Gray jumping up from centre back, and then there were different players arriving in the different positions, but it was the same overall structure. The problem with the defensive side of things is that with Archie Gray dropping out, as you say, the midfield is suddenly a little bit more evacuated. You're essentially pressing with one fewer player, and I think in the post-match comments, Postecoglou said, we got our organisation wrong, and I think it was really clear from that goal that you mentioned, the Ndiaye goal, where basically Spurs get pulled one way across, and then the ball comes to the other side, and it's like, Archie Gray has to jump up and then that's it, right? That's the defensive action is sort of making sure that he stops Ndiaye from doing anything, and then once he doesn't, that's it. He's in running at the back line.
I was more alarmed actually by the first goal, the one where I think Dragusin steps up, but then Archie Gray doesn't realise he has to cover, and I felt like that kept happening throughout the game. I don't know about you guys, but it kind of felt like it almost felt like the inverse of the Stellini game against Newcastle when they've been playing back three all season. He switched to a back four. It was very clear they'd spent like minimal time training in the back four and they got torn apart. It felt like the inverse. It switched. I guess that's why, despite my defence of Postecoglou, I'd be scathing of him in this game like Jack Pickbrook was, because it did feel like they switched to a back three without very much preparation, and there was very little coordination of Archie Gray going, okay, Dragusin has stepped out, I need to cover here, and vice versa. I think it was to the third goal, second goal, and build up to the third, one of those two, where as well, like Archie Gray's stepped out from his right centre-back position, and Dragusin like spends about 5 seconds before realising, oh, I've got to cover this space, and then Everton just run into it.
Yeah, there's about 20 metres between Porro in the wing-back position and then Dragusin that Gray opened up. So, yeah, I agree with you. Let's just talk a little bit about the immediate future, because I think the question of replacing a manager mid-season, I think, has been tempered by what's happened at Man United so far this season, with big questions asked about that whole project on the basis of having brought in Ruben Amorim midway through the season and it not working out. So, I guess the question is, have we learned the lesson now that, you know, it's almost never beneficial to remove a manager midway through the season? And I suppose the flip side to that would be, well, we've just said that in the last 6 games Spurs are in relegation form. Like, at what point does that become a problem if they keep a manager who has them playing in relegation form?
I suppose the kind of almost non-backing of Postecoglou argument for keeping Postecoglou, if that makes sense, is that, as you say, it never works, or very rarely works, changing a manager mid-season. So you kind of, and there is an element of gamble to this, but you still basically write off the league on the assumption that there are at least 3 such bad teams below them. They're not going to get relegated, but they're still in 3 cup competitions, maybe one of them for not too much longer, given that they're, you know, I don't know, you wouldn't necessarily trust them to hold on to a 1-0 league against Liverpool in the League Cup semi-final. So you kind of sort of hope that keeping the established manager will maybe get them one of those cups, or get them a long way into one of those cups, maybe to a final, to sort of salvage some sense of pride and dignity out of the season. But as you say, in relegation form, you are kind of gambling on things getting better, but then that could, the sort of flip side of that is you could back yourself into a Manchester United shaped corner, where if you stick with Postecoglou and he sort of almost accidentally wins the League Cup or the FA Cup or whatever, then you left for the decision, well, can we actually sack a manager who's just won a first trophy in, what will it be, 17 years? No, hang on, longer than that. 2008 I think was. Yeah, 17 years. So yeah, it's a tricky one.
Another Manchester United conundrum for them.
Exactly, yeah. Do you want to be Daniel Levy? Do you want to be Manchester United? Probably not.
Yeah. Interestingly, on the back of that question, talking about managers not making a difference midway through the season, this was obviously the second game in the Premier League, at least for David Moyes, who seems to have made Everton a little bit better, Alex.
Yes, he does. He would have been in charge of Everton in 2008, wouldn't he?
Probably would. Yeah,
he would have been. I would have just entered primary school just to make both of you feel.
Sake. I had enough of this talking to young colleagues yesterday as well. It's just
we're coming for all.
You sicken me.
With David Moyes, I mean, it's nice to see him back. I must say, with this game, I was very much more distracted by how easy Tottenham made it for him to win. But it is, it is good to see him back in the job, and I guess it will be interesting to see how he takes Everton forward. But I guess it's like how far he can take him forward with his style of play, and it's worth remembering as well how badly things ended for him at West Ham. I've seen, obviously he's a legend at West Ham for what he won, but there were some nerdy West Ham fans on my timeline that I of course follow who are saying, listen, it is worth remembering how bad the league form did get, even in the season they won the UEFA Conference League. So let's see how it plays out. Is my take.
Yeah, so was it on Sky? The pundits were talking about how it's a sideways step from Dyche. Would you agree with that, Nick? Do you think Moyes from Dyche to Moyes is a sideways step?
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. It's they did. I'm just looking at the long ball sort of they attempted, and they are moving to David Moyes is not exactly a kind of huge step in a progressive direction, and they have been playing kind of more or less the identical team in the last couple of games, but they're playing sort of fairly significantly fewer long balls. Dyche's last game, I'm just according to FB Ref, 85 they attempted in the game, which is absolutely mad, and 67 yesterday. So it's not a huge, from a very much a layman's perspective, not a huge stylistic change, but it does seem, and for all we kind of talk about the stylistic changes and the tactics, kind of happier vibes might just kind of get you through to the rest of the season, as kind of reductive as that is.
They seemed pretty intense yesterday, I thought. Everton, like a big part of it was just, he'd got them fired up and they were making life difficult for Spurs, and I think at the moment that's all you need to do to beat Spurs, so it's good to do that. Although I would say that there was positive signs. I think that in certain situations Moyes is going to be an upgrade on Dyche. I think one of the criticisms that I've had over the years of Dyche is that his team have to rely on counter-attacks in certain situations, but they don't seem very well prepared for them, whereas I think the opposite is true for Moyes. I think he knows that that's what his teams have to do, and he prepares his teams very well for that, and I think we saw a few examples of that in the game itself. So yeah, just because that, I suppose they're both I suppose slightly more, I don't want to say pragmatic because it's just a meaningless word, but they both play similar play styles doesn't mean to say that we're just going to get exactly the same from one that we got from the other.
Well, the pragmatic thing is obviously, is obviously a word that's misused, but people usually will cite managers like Postecoglou or Amorim as the players who, as managers, who play a certain way regardless of the circumstances. But it felt like Dyche was doing that with Everton as well. It's certainly, I mean, this is a very kind of small example, but I was at their game against Forest a few weeks ago, and it felt like a few times like their centre backs would look over at the bench, and Dyche would just kind of tell them to hoof it long again, and they would give him a look as if to say, please don't make me do this again. So yeah, it was a tactic, certainly in that game and in a lot of games, that clearly was not working, but Dyche stuck to it anyway. So yeah, as you say, pragmatic is a sort of meaningless / much misused word, which is often applied to Dyche, but it just didn't feel like he was doing that.
Yeah, and I think Moyes is also going to get more players into the penalty box for attacking moments as well. And one of the beneficiaries of that was Dominic Calvert-Lewin. He scored a really nice goal for the opener. Any thoughts on DCL? DLC?
DCL indeed. I mean, he's always an FPL asset of mine, and I put him in, he gets injured immediately. And that's
you say an FPL asset of mine?
Yes.
Asset. Okay. No, carry on.
I'll let you judge my English.
Are you an FPL?
No, very much not. But FPL asset makes it sound like it's a team of assassins or something like that.
Exactly, yeah.
Asset, when applied to people, asset is you only ever hear that in like cold business speak or when they're an assassin.
Oh, you have to be very detached with this. Yeah. I may have said before, but my FPL is just about beating my friend who got into football up 4 years ago and immediately became one of the best FPL players in the country. So my whole time every year is to try and beat him, and I sometimes turn to Dominic Calvert-Lewin for that.
Are you trying to turn it back to football?
Oh, there we go.
I mean, the fact that you have a friend who can play FPL and become the best player in 4 years, having never really watched football, says everything you need to know for me about FPL. Having said that, I am quite addicted to FPL at the moment because I'm playing a draft with some friends, which is the much more superior version of FPL. But we have a special rules. You can only have players from teams who finished in the bottom half last season. So I have Chris Wood, and let me tell you, Nick, he is a valuable player for me. In
you are welcome.
But anyway, yes. Speaking of assets, another asset is DCL. So yeah, were you going to say something, or did I derail you?
No, you did not derail me. Yeah, it was a very nice goal he scored at the weekend. I guess. Yeah, my thoughts have always been on him that he's a very nice forward and just very, very injury prone. But he speaks to a wider thing with Everton, I guess, for me, which is the slight concern for Moyes would be that at West Ham, not to take anything away from him, he did incredibly well there. But West Ham's squad was, I think, markedly better than Everton's, right? When they won the UEFA Conference League, it wasn't a case of this was the underdog doing it. They were still seen as one of, if not the best team in that competition, alongside Fiorentina when they won it. They had likes of Lucas Paqueta in that side. They added Mohamed Kudus a year later as well. Whereas with Everton, Dominic Calvert-Lewin is probably their best player, one of their best players alongside Ndiaye. And you do have that fear of, can he get... I doubt he can get Everton as high up the table as he managed to get West Ham, near the top 6, without as significant investment that West Ham managed to plunge into their team. So I think I like Dominic Calvert-Lewin, but I guess when I think of him, I just think of Everton's wider potential quality problem. And it's not to be all doom and gloom. They beat Tottenham at the weekend. It's just that thinking of how far will they go under Moyes? How far are fans expecting them to take them? Is it, and the perception of David Moyes right now in the Premier League, I wonder how that develops at Everton, because if he just becomes another manager who can't get Everton out of the bottom 5, then that'll be a bit sad to see.
Well, obviously all of our listeners are now rushing to their FPL teams to bring in that fantastic asset in Dominic Calvert-Lewin. So we're going to take a break here. Well, what a wonderful break that was. Manchester United 1, Brighton 3. That was very Alexander James Gordon, wasn't it? It wasn't very Joe Devine. But another Manchester United loss. A Manchester United loss, which was followed up by Ruben Amorim making the headlines himself, consciously saying, here's your headline. Because he said, we are the worst team maybe in the history of Manchester United. I know you, the media, want headlines, but I'm saying that because we have to acknowledge that and to change that. Here you go, your headlines. What do you reckon, Nick? Worst Manchester United team of all time?
Well, no, they have been relegated 4 times, so maybe...
you never know. Yeah. You never know.
I suppose maybe he's applying it to the Gary Neville line from a few weeks ago where he said pound for pound, the worst team in the division, which is difficult to argue with. I don't really understand why he's doing this. What's the value in a manager after admittedly kind of quite calamitous defeats saying these things? We are the worst Manchester United team ever. We might get relegated. Why? There is lowering expectations, and then there is kind of bumming everyone out. Really, I just don't understand. Maybe he's one of those people who's just been encouraged too much to say what's on their mind and express their feelings.
And generally done within a positive context, right? Where I think it changes the tenor of everything you say completely, right? If you're winning and you make these sort of wry comments, it's fair enough. If you're losing, suddenly they become much worse.
Just imagine if you, it's the sort of person that... So in a previous job, previous life, I worked for a company that was on the 3rd floor of a building, and I got into the lift with a colleague and I said, all right, mate, how's it going? And between the ground floor and the 3rd floor, he told me that his wife wanted to leave him. And it's one of those, Amorim feels like that kind of person that if you just said, all right, mate, how's it going? And you expect in the normal course of human interaction for you to say, yeah, not too bad, I think it was going. But he would burden his soul on you, which in a completely inappropriate situation. Yeah, basically, that's. But it's not even. I don't know. Is it even honesty? Are they actually the worst Manchester United team ever? Are they going to get relegated? No, I don't think they are. So it's like, if he was being honest, he would perhaps say, well, actually, maybe this is the problem. Maybe it's a kind of misdirection from the actual problem, which is, this isn't really working, and it is still relatively early days, but I'm insisting on playing this formation that isn't really suited to the players available. And am I kind of banking on this this club buying me a couple of wing backs in either this month or in the summer, which whether they want to do that, having already sort of, this is also the problem with appointing a manager who has such a defined system or a way of playing. So because, you know, say they do spend 80 million quid on a couple of wing backs in this transfer window, the next, and then they get to October and it still isn't working and everyone is still kind of wailing, and Christ knows what Amorim will say at that point. What do they do then? They've just kind of left with this collection of players that are suited to not suited to most other managers. So yeah, it's more classic Manchester United.
Moving on from what Nick was saying about the formation and the fact that, you know, what we have in Amorim, for better or for worse, is another idealistic manager. And by idealistic manager, I mean a manager who clearly has ideas about how his team should play and wants to stick to those. Fabian Hürzeler came out after the game and said, basically, we knew how Man United were going to set up in this game. Do we think that that's a problem? I suppose, not least because we're not just talking about the tactical aspects here, but we're talking about the more general squad aspects as well. Because clearly there's a lot of work to do with this squad to make it functional enough to be able to play the 3-4-3 system that Amorim likes to use. Feels to me like a massive risk to be like, okay, well, the squad as it is doesn't really work with this system, but if we brought in, you know, as you said, spend 80 million on a couple of wing backs and then X, Y, and Z. Well, now we need back three centre backs. We also need midfielders who can work in a two generally. Now we need our wide players to be narrow players, etc. Suddenly, what you're doing is spending a lot of money to make a squad which fits a very specific style of play, which isn't the dominant style of play, I would say, in elite football. So, what are your thoughts on that, Alex?
Yeah, it was nice to hear Nick on a similar train of thought to me. I've gone very far down the rails of this train, and I'm already in that camp of, answering your question, I'm not sure it's worth going with the amount of investment that you're going to need to transform the squad into Amorim's ideas. And like touching on first of all what you said about Fabian Hürzeler and what the idea of what you know you're going to get with Manchester United, like that was a problem with appointing Amorim mid-season as well. Like it's like teams are more prepared It's like teams are more prepared to play Manchester United than Manchester United are to prepared to play those teams, because they haven't got the way they want to. They can't play the way they want to play at the maximum level they'd like to. Whereas other teams can prepare for it pretty easily because they're such a structured team. But yeah, like bringing it forward to that point of where do you almost go from here? And I think it's a question that's going to keep cropping up because of the pressure Amorim's now inviting himself under by saying it's the worst Man United team of ever, however dramatic he's going to be. Because like you look at their PSR restrictions at the moment, obviously came out recently, they consider selling Garnacho and Mainu because of like PSR restrictions they need to sell before they can buy first team players. So like let's just lay it out simply, right? If you are Manchester United's hierarchy and you go, okay, we need to make this team a back three team. We not just a back three team actually. We need to make it to be the best back three team probably in Europe because we want to win trophies. We want to compete for the Premier League. That's our goal. Ruben Amorim is our guy. We've brought him to do that. Okay, we're probably going to need a new left wing back, probably a new right wing back if they want to get that really high level. Probably new centre backs as well because not all of them suit the way they want to play. Probably a new striker, maybe new forwards, maybe a new midfielder. So to do all of that, you're not only going to need to invest heavily, you're also going to need to properly sell, like we said, one of your better players, one of the players who would probably suit the team right now. That's why you might even need that new midfielder, right? Because you might need to sell Mainu to bring in the funds to be able to do this. So exactly what Nick said. What happens if you get to the summer, you've stumbled to like a 12th or 11th, 10th place finish, and you're looking, okay, where do we go from here? Do we, A, stick with Amorim, spend a ton of money investing into this squad, fixing it for how he wants to play, and then maybe risk that idea of if he doesn't get this to work, we're now left with a back three team, which Amorim isn't getting the best out of, in a market where there's not actually that many back three managers you can go for. Like there's Simone Inzaghi at Inter, he never seems tempted to leave Inter. There's Xabi Alonso at Leverkusen. He's kind of switching from that and probably wouldn't go to Manchester United given his history at Liverpool as well. So do you go with that, with the idea that if Amorim goes, you're left with a squad that you might just have to get a back four manager in and put all the work back into transitioning the squad back the other way?
And money.
Yeah, and the money. Or do you get to the summer and go, well, if there's someone better than Ruben Amorim, do we actually hire them instead?
I think, I can't remember where I've said this before, but I think he thought it would be much easier to repurpose some players than it actually has turned out to be, because he did this a little bit at Sporting, where he kind of turned wingers into wing backs, which I suppose Amad Diallo has done him over very slightly by probably being their best player in two positions, because he's pretty good at wing back but he's probably better suited to one of the two. You
probably
roles.
want him there. That's the difficulty with it, right? It's like he's been great as a wing back, but you're like, do you really want to build a team around a best player being a wing back? It's a sort of weird conundrum for him.
It's also that point as well, like you said. He maybe thought it'd be easier to repurpose these players, but maybe the challenge as well is not just, Harry Maguire has been fine in the back three so far from the games I've watched. I think he's been okay, but I think it's also very clear that he's not going to be of the level to, for Man United to win a title, right, or challenge for a title. So even the players you can, I guess, reformat or reposition in this team, they might work to get some results. But if you want to get even better results, at some point you're going to need to replace them as well. So it's just such an insurmountable challenge.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think watching Amorim unfold casts an interesting shadow back on what happened with Erik ten Hag, right? And that's not me wanting to retcon Ten Hag's career at Manchester United, because I think largely it was quite bad. But I think very early on you saw with Ten Hag that he realised that the enormity of his task, that he wasn't going to be able to make this team into some kind of high possession team that were going to control games, and he really lent into trying to make Manchester United the best transition team in the world, right? And I think we're probably seeing the same thing with Amorim, but arguably with less effect, because I mean the thing you end up with Amorim is that his team just end up being super defensive, because you've essentially taken a player from further forward and dropped them back. So the defensive numbers look better; they just don't look like they're ever scoring, right? So it's so funny, because at the moment I'm watching Wolf Hall, the critically acclaimed drama about Thomas Cromwell, and I'm watching it and I'm thinking about Manchester United managers. So Wolf Hall is the story of Henry VIII, right, who marries all of these women and deals with them in various different ways, as you know, six wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived.
I thought you were censoring Henry VIII for a second.
Yeah. And for these women, it's very much. I see Henry VIII as being the Manchester United of the Tudor period, right? Because you've got this problem to fix. The problem being, in this instance, trying to provide this guy with a male heir. But you've got the same thing with Manchester United, right? It's like there's so much at stake. It's like if you can fix this problem, you're going to be set for life. But if you don't, there's the risk of being, divorced, beheaded, or dying. So. I thought that was kind of interesting. Then I got thinking, how would you categorise all the Manchester United managers, in terms of divorced, beheaded, survived? Because there's some who've definitely been kind of expediently yeeted, but there's others who've sort of gracefully disappeared, and you could even argue that some of them survived. So I would argue that Ole Gunnar Solskjaer probably survived, relatively speaking. Yeah. Whereas Rangnick definitely beheaded, I would say.
No, I think he died. I think he died, but just under the situation of it. It's just, I just can't handle this. My heart and my brain just faltered.
I would have Rangnick as Anne of Cleves, a kind of brief and ill thought out.
I mean, many of them were ill thought out.
Oh, sure, yeah. But it was less that he was beheaded, and more kind of fairly early on everyone kind of went, yeah, this isn't working, let's maybe just kind of maybe just go our separate ways. Whereas
Solskjaer is definitely Jane Seymour, I would say, sort of like beloved, but kind of
but ultimately unsuited. Well, I say ultimately suited, she died, but
which makes her unsuited, right? If you die, it's not great to be a consort to the king.
Yeah, and then of course Catherine Howard famously failed to implement a back three formation in the court. So the analogy holds.
Yeah, I think so. Any thoughts on the Tudor period? A bit before your time.
I did.
Before all our times.
I did geography at A level, not history. So while you guys are naming the wives, I'm like, yeah, nodding along. I know he had 6 wives. Didn't have 7. No, he had 6, and that's as far as my knowledge goes.
But this is possibly good because we were taught about the Tudors far too much at school. Mm. We know far too much about this kind of very brief period in English history. Yeah,
do you ascribe to that view that the Tudors were over? Yeah, I don't know, because I kind of feel like it's a big period, right? It's like if you consider the English schooling system's history trajectory, it's kind of like we pick the big areas where things like Civil War, right? Could have gone one way, could have gone the other. Tudor period could have gone one way, ended up with the Church of England, right?
This is that clip that was going around from TalkSport the other day
of Alan Brazil
and was it Cundy or so?
No, it was
Jamie
Ray Parlour.
Was it Ray Parlour?
Yeah, I think so. And they were talking.
Could have gone either way.
Yeah, but it couldn't it? Right? Yeah. I mean, imagine we could all be Catholics right now.
Yeah, well, some of us are.
I think with that we should probably approach the Midway Game. So the Midway Game, as you guys know, happens off air, so the listeners can't tell what the answers are. So we will push you over to a break, and then we'll be back with the results of the Midway Game. The Midway Game not completed again, I'm afraid. I had high hopes with the sagacity of Nick and the Euro expertness of Alex over here, but no, alas. The game still hasn't been won. Another game that we've come up with recently, actually, is the Yeet a Ton of Money game, which is a game I invented without any rules. And actually, the most fun part of this game is inventing the rules as we go, or trying to understand what's at stake here. I actually was contacted by a listener on this topic who said, "Hey John, love the pod. I think the Yeet a Ton of Money game only works with teams who are otherwise very good with one obvious weakness, which is why Isaac to Arsenal is such a good one. Whereas with teams with multiple positions that need filling, Manchester United, for example, I would argue that there's not a single Yeet a Ton of Money option that makes sense. And it is this approach which has arguably got them into this mess in the first place. Would love to know your thoughts." So yeah, to reiterate to you guys, if you haven't been following along, I just said there's some transfers where if a team are offered a player, they should just be like, we don't need to do due diligence. We don't need to send our nerds away or scouts away to go and scout them. We just accept the fee and just yeet the money at them. And we used Isaac to Arsenal in that respect. I wondered if either of you two had any thoughts on that. Maybe the bigger question here, like how much of this is to do with teams? Because it seems to me that what is happening here is that there's some teams who are just very close to being good. They just have a piece missing. So with Arsenal, if you think if you just throw a striker into that Arsenal team, suddenly they become much better. And generally, I think that these teams have to be sort of very good because they've got the money to yeet, but also just close enough that the addition of a single player could actually change their fortune. So, any thoughts on potentials here?
I suppose there's a Newcastle and a right winger. Don't have a particular example to.
I saw someone say Ben Doak actually to this the other day.
It's interesting.
So it seems as though Ben Doak is potentially gettable for it's going to be not a ton of money. It's going to be 30, 40 mil, which is I guess a lot for a player who's that young, but it also sort of makes a degree of sense. You kind of think if they got a player like him in, it could offer a bit.
I put Takakubo in a sensible transfers video recently for them, and I've recently thought Bakayoko might actually be a better fit.
Hey, what's going on with Bakayoko? It feels like he's been touted around in the last few transfer windows worth of sensible transfers, but he's
had a little bit of a quieter season, but I think he's doing better. I think goals wise this season, or he's as good, and his assists have fallen off a bit, but his underlying numbers suggest they're still quite good. So he scored the other day as well. So Bakayoko still looks like a good player.
You had a suggestion for Arsenal as well, which does suggest that this is maybe a team thing.
Yes. My suggestion. I like the Alexander Isak suggestion. I guess my Yeet a Ton of Money suggestion for Arsenal would be different. It would be Bradley Barcola of PSG, which feels like a transfer that's slightly more realistic now because they've brought in Kavica Kvaratskhelia. In this game, do I give more explanation, or is it just you yeet this money and you get him in?
Well, I mean, I think we can then judge it whether or not it feels like a
Oh, okay. So I have to defend my shout.
I don't even think you need to defend it, really. Like, if you don't want to, because
Nick might be feeling very scrutinising.
True, but like Joe's big thing is that it's like a feeling thing. It's just sort of like feels right.
Yeah, if the vibes are good with this, it feels very right indeed.
What would you say, Nick?
This game is kind of a slightly more refined version of that thing where a transfer, it becomes so obvious that people on sorry to say TalkSport again, but people on TalkSport will say things like, "Just go out and get him." Whoever it says, just go out and get him. Give him what he wants.
I'll drive him there myself.
Exactly. Yeah, that kind of thing. But it's, again, more refined.
I love that idea though, that the only thing holding this transfer back is the logistics,
the transport.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But don't worry, I'll offer my car as tribute.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you're saying soft, good vibes feels okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we should talk about PSG, as we've got the Euro expert himself here. Alex, give us a little bit of a summary of where PSG are at right now in terms of maybe the big picture as well, because I know you've been following them for a few years. How does this PSG sort of fit into the last few years of the narrative of the big French club?
Well, they're in a bit of an interesting place because obviously without Kylian Mbappe for the first season, and as a result, their pressing is more aggressive than ever. If you look at the underlying, like PPDA, their passes per defensive.
You say more aggressive than ever, you mean it exists?
Yes, actually, that's the best way of putting it. They actually press now. I think a good number for all this, actually. Last season, it was kind of similar, to be fair. The PPDA was like high sevens. Now it's like 7.3.
For people who don't know what PPDA is.
Yes, it's passes per defensive action. So it's the amount of passes until your team looks to press, looks to try and win the ball back. So the lower the number, the more aggressive a team it suggests they are. And like 7 is very aggressive. I think the lowest in the Premier League is around 8 or 9. So it gives you an idea of just how aggressive PSG are at the moment. And that is like a big climb down from not last season, the season before, where Christophe Gaultier was in charge instead of Luis Enrique. It was around 11 at that point. Obviously, before then, they had Mauricio Pochettino, and that was a stint that ended a lot in protests. Same with Gaultier as well. But at the moment, they're in a bit of a weird spot because in terms of the league, they're actually on course to go unbeaten, which, believe it or not, it will be the first time they've ever done that. I was surprised to know that stat myself. But the paradox is they are the worst performing French team in the Champions League, one of the worst performing French teams in Europe, because there's other teams, I think, other than Nice, in the Europa League that are doing well. Lyon certainly doing quite well in the Europa League. And they obviously play Manchester City this week. So I think if they lose this, then I can't remember the table exactly, but the odds are very high. They don't even make it into the playoff for the round of 16. So it's a very big week for them. And obviously, they've recently signed Kvaratskhelia. I guess like the other element of the big picture stuff here is they seem to be getting a bit more credit with transfers. We spoke about them the other day in the office, and someone said, I don't like it. PSG seem like a smart club now. Feels a bit wrong. Feels a bit awkward. I mean, Kvaratskhelia goes into a front line of many attacking players. The reason I mentioned Bradley Barcola to Arsenal is because him and Kvaratskhelia on paper play in the same position, but as we'll get into, Enrique's mixed about a lot of his team. I think he's used about 5 or 6 different players up front. So you might see Kvaratskhelia or Barcola play as a false 9. But it's a very interesting point in the PSG project, so to speak. It could be, this season, genuinely, it could go 2 ways. It could be their best ever season or potentially their worst in the Qatari era.
I thought this transfer window I found quite funny from a PSG point of view because it sort of outlines the problem with having like fairly ephemeral transfer policies, because they made this big thing about the phases of their development under the Qatari ownership, and how now they're in the we're going to sign the best young French players and we're going to build our team around that, which is fine until one of them turns out to be not very good and you're sending him on loan to Juventus in Colomani, and then a really good player becomes available, and you just sign him in Kvaratskhelia. So it's kind of yes, we are continuing this kind of ideological policy of signing the best young French players until we can get some better players.
I was thinking that phases language is quite convenient, isn't it? You can always be like, well, we're in a different phase now.
Yeah.
And if it's not going so well, you're like, yeah, but there's other phases after that. This is almost like the mediating phase between good and good. Gets you out of a lot of sticky situations. So yeah, just one more thing on PSG, because I think what's interesting about this is that you've mentioned that this has probably made them much stronger in the league, made them much worse as a knockout tournament prospect. Although having said that, I mean, they're playing badly in the league stage of the Champions League, so maybe this invalidates everything that I'm about to say. But it's generally the case that you get these teams, these Galactico teams, they tend to be sort of good to go for knockout games where you can get fired up for that game and you get through tournaments. And then these teams where they're actually good in the league tend to be more conservative, maybe a little bit more patient in possession. It can be harder to fire those teams up for knockout tournaments. So there tends to be, and this is very reductionist, I think, but some teams who are good at league play and some teams that are good at, I guess, more knockout scenarios. Do you think that Luis Enrique is just essentially been able to move them from one paradigm to the other because he has lost Mbappe and he has been able to sort of construct his team a little bit more sensibly in that sense?
Well, I think it is worth unpacking like what's happened in the Champions League a little bit. I think the problem there has been against some of the weakest teams, they've struggled to create chances. Against Girona, for example, the first game I watched, there were some positive noises coming from Paris because they dominated the ball, and I remember watching that game thinking they've not created much at all. They've also had some sabotaging moments in the Champions League, which I think it's fair to mention while we have this conversation, mainly from Donnarumma. Enrique has had to rotate his goalkeeper this season because he doesn't have confidence in either him or Matvey Safonov, the Russian goalkeeper who was brought in the window. As a side note, actually, how old do you want to guess Gianluigi Donnarumma is? Because I was shocked by how old he actually is.
He must be like 24 or something. 24,
oh, okay,
25.
you're actually on the right.
Because he was absurdly young when he started at Milan, wasn't he? So.
Yeah, he's 25. I thought he was still I thought he was going to be high 20s because it feels like he has been around for ages, right?
He was actually 16, I think, when he not just made his debut, was like Milan's starting goalkeeper every week.
Yeah, it's
mad.
The awkward thing with him is that it's like he came through at such a young age, and he almost feels outdated now because he's been so bad with the ball at his feet. It's just not in his DNA almost. It's when he gets the ball at his feet, it's just like David De Gea, like very awkward, can't really play it out nicely. The technique's like very off. So Enrique's had to deal with that. But in terms of what you talk about, the paradigm shift there of like now they've become more dominant side in league play versus Champions League. I think more than ever, as someone who's got a big love for French football, I will always try and defend that league. I think that that difference between their form can be explained more than ever by the difference in quality in Ligue 1 and the Champions League, because Enrique at the moment, tactically, he's doing quite a bold, I'd say risky thing with his midfield. So it generally consists of Warren Zaire, their young wonder kid, João Neves, the Portuguese player who's brought in the summer window, and Vitinha, the other Portuguese midfielder who, in my opinion, is one of the best midfielders in the world. But these players are all very small, not very physical. PSG have won the fewest aerial duels in Europe's top 5 leagues. And what Enrique has allowed them to do is have a lot of positional freedom. So a good example of where this can get caught is against PSV, where I think it's Vitinha looking to build up from the back. He's like their 6 in their 4-3-3. He passes the ball forward, looks to make a forward run beyond, I think it would have been Zaire Emery's pass to. PSG lose it, and then all of a sudden they have no midfield whatsoever, and they're just allowed to be attacked on. And in Ligue 1, they're often able to defend these situations or just keep the ball. Their progression in Ligue 1's been great. Like, they can score some really nice goals because by throwing more players forward, right, you're able to overload different areas and build nice attacking moves. But when you lose it, you obviously putting yourself at a huge risk. And I think in the Champions League, like, they've come up against sterner defences who, despite the nice attacking moves they've been able to put together, found it harder to unpick them, and also tougher teams on the counter, or at least teams maybe getting a bit more luck on the counter, especially with Donnarumma struggling this season. Note the goal against Atletico Madrid where they lost they lost in the final minute because Donnarumma lets it slip underneath him. They're getting done on the counter a bit more as well. So I guess it's less about the way, like the general style, the way they're trying to play under Enrique, like that sort of tactical shift. I think it's more the smaller details is a reason why they seem to have quite a soft underbelly at the moment. And, you know, looking at them against Manchester City, they almost have similar problems, right? Two teams who are kind of awkward in transition, but whereas with City, I think you can say that's more to do with the players, and you swap those players out, then they'll start defending counters a lot better. I think with PSG, it's the players being quite small, playing not the best physically and defensively, and also the tactics on top of that.
Well, thank you. That's a really nice summary of PSG. And from PSG to PAB, it's time for Points Are Bad. Which I have to admit, we've been thrown under the bus this week, lads, because no one who's usually on this show is on this show. Everyone is away. There's only me who actually made a prediction last week, and there's only 3 of us in here, and we need 4 people to do the prediction. So we're going to play this by ear. And we'll see how we go. But anyway, last time out, this was a show went out on the 14th of January. You know what? I did really, really well. I only added 2 points. Now, Steve has worked out the points this week. Producer Steve, he's not here today. He's a little bit under the weather. I don't think he really understands the game, so there's a strong possibility that he's actually given me a really good score by mistake. As a result, I'm not going to look at what the scores were last week. I'm just going to keep it as it is because I've done well. But JJ, in true form, had the worst performance. He added 8 points last week. He is now on 89 points, holding up the propping up the table for Points Are Bad. Seb added 6 points, so he's on 86 points. And Joe added 5 points, puts him on 70 points. So he is still in the league, but I am rapidly catching up to him because, I had a nice little result this week. So the games that we picked last week were Arsenal 2-1 Tottenham Hotspur, and then, of course, the Scottish Cup game between Falkirk and Wraith Rovers, which actually turned out to be a win for Wraith Rovers. So I think the question is, what games should we have for next week? And I think maybe the best way of doing this is because it's Forest versus Bournemouth. It's essentially us pitted against each other. And then we'll let you have the PSG game. So PSG have a game against Stade Reims.
Oh, fun.
Thoughts on that game? Is that going to be an easy win for PSG?
Reims are quite an awkward team, press man to man, so that could be tricky. Enrique actually did say at the weekend they played Will Still's Lens. Will Still is still at Lens. PSG definitely struggle against aggressive teams, so maybe this will be the one that catches them out.
I saw they went a goal down against Lens, didn't they? But then ended up winning.
Yeah, they talent advantage their way to a win through Bradley Barcola.
As is so often the case with elite sides. So the next thing that we need to sort out is who is going to represent who. So Joe has actually written in the list here who's going to represent who. So we've got Rachel, who's in the booth. She's going to be JJ this week. So that means she's going to pick first. So then Nick, you're going to be Seb. Alex, you're going to be Joe, and then I'm going to be me, if that's okay with everyone. So the question is, Rachel, what do you think the results are going to be? So no. The first one is Notts Forest.
Not going to rise to it.
Notts Forest versus the mighty Bournemouth. Rachel, who do you think is going to be the victor there? What score are you going with?
That may be 3-2 to Nottingham Forest.
Wow, 3-2. So JJ, 3-2. Very much a spirit of the game pick. So Seb, Stafford Miller.
Hello. I can't do a Seb impression. Maybe I should. He speaks close to the mic, doesn't he? Anyway, I think it will be 2-2.
2-2. And Alex Devine.
Hello. I'm going to go with Notts Forest 1 and Bournemouth 1.
He did the Notts Forest as well, did that?
I'm not going to rise to it.
And I obviously am going to go 1-2. 1-2. So let's go back around the carousel. We should probably have done them in order, but PSG versus Reims. JJ, what are you going for?
I think that would be a cheeky 2-0 to PSG, maybe.
Okay, 2-0. It's a very sensible pick. Nick?
I'm going to go 4-1 to PSG.
4-1 to PSG. Alex?
I'm going to go 3-0.
3-0. And I will go 3-1. Yeah, there we go. Points are bad. All done, dusted, out of the way. So I think that brings us to the end of the podcast. Points are bad, out of the way. Before we get to the very end of the show, though, just a message from Joe Devine, our dear leader. We have exciting news. We have a show coming up in London at the end of the season. So it's just before the last game of the season, I think. There'll be more info on that, when and where it is, next week, but we're embargoed from saying anything more than that. But that's just some exciting news to get you guys thinking that there's going to be a Tifo live show somewhere at some point in the future. So I've done my job.
Very theoretical at this stage.
Yes, very theoretical, but yeah, something to look forward to. But other than that, the only thing to look forward to is the end of this podcast. So, Nick, thank you so much for stepping into the void.
No problem.
Alex, great to have you on as always.
Thank you very much.
Rach, thank you for sorting things out in the booth.
Thank you.
And yeah, this is the end. So, bye.